Many people have set out to write accounts about the events that were fulfilled millennia ago. They used the eyewitness reports circulating among them from the early disciples. Having carefully investigated everything from the beginning, Luke also decided to write an accurate report for you, most honorable Theophilus, so you can be certain of the truth. Tradition teaches us that Matthew, Mark, and John were native Israelites, but Luke wasn't. He was an outsider. He wrote a couple of books, letters to a Theophilus. The name Theophilus means friend of God. These books are either addressed to a person whose name means friend of God, or to a type of person who is a friend of God. I'm leaning towards the latter. And when you look through Luke's stories, we see that time and time again, it's the outsider that Jesus goes to. The poor, the captive, the blind, the oppressed. It's the outsider that is that friend of God. I want us to allow this thought that it is the outsider who is the true friend of God to encourage us throughout our days, perhaps even give us a new way of viewing the world and the Bible. My name is Damian. I am a Renegade Cleric. Here on this channel, we will be discussing a theology of the outsider. I call it Xenotology. I didn't invent the term, but I'm hoping to snag it from a couple of other uses and websites out there. Xenotology is not xenology. That's about extraterrestrials. It's also not xenophobia. That's about fear and hate. No, xenotology is a theology of the outsider. Excuse me. For the past 14 or so years, I've been a minister with the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, and I had the pleasure of serving in churches and missions from Wahoo, Hawaii to Boise, Idaho, all the way to Zagreb, Croatia, with different organizations. And I unapologetically love God, and I love the church, and I love the outsider. I learned a few things from being in these various locations. First, there are some really awesome people all over the world. Second, a lot of people have been hurt by people who call themselves Christians or representatives of the church. But mainly, I've learned that God loves outsiders. In this video, I want to lay some foundations for Xenotology, or theology of the outsider. We're mainly going to be looking through the books of Luke and Acts to start with. And there are a couple foundational assumptions that will need to be made. First, the biblical record is a reliable piece of literature. And second, Luke was a real person. Now, before you start crushing me in the comments below, understand that Calvin and Augustine and Luther all acknowledge the literary qualities of the Bible. And even though I am a liberal cleric, I do hold firm to some traditional positions concerning inspiration and so on. Seeing the Bible as literature doesn't make it fictional. Not every type of literature is fiction. And not everything in the Bible is a historical narrative either. If you want to learn more about these, then leave me a comment below, and we can talk about it in a future video. While you're leaving that comment, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button. It does help the channel grow. So, is the Bible reliable? Yes. Is the Bible accurate? Yes. Can it be proven scientifically? Well, not really. Some of it can, but I mean, really, no. The Bible is mostly a record of historical events, and historical events need to be treated differently than a scientific experiment. No matter what someone may tell you, history is not science. History is not an art. History is history. Think about that for a minute. Is science really the only way of learning things? Is it the only way to prove something? No, it's not. Take yesterday, for instance, right? You're going to have a difficult time proving yesterday existed scientifically. There is evidence that yesterday existed, and we can gather and then evaluate that evidence. There's oral evidence and written and physical evidence. And we should gather that evidence and take a look at it methodically, and as precise as possible. But it just isn't scientific. And that's not a bad thing. We can spend hours going into it, and I love looking at the geographical, social, political, even the religious evidence that does exist to support the stories that are in the Bible. And, if you're interested in that, then say so. Leave a comment down at the video. Speaking of this evidence that demands a verdict, there's also some people who say that the Bible is full of contradictions and such. Well, let's define a contradiction, okay? To call something a contradiction would imply that it is being both affirmed and denied at the same time. So like my coffee cup. This cup is both full and empty at the same time. It's not. Over the course of the next few minutes, it will go from fuller to emptier, but that's different. What most people are calling contradictions are probably most likely just a difference. And there are differences. But you need to ask yourself, if you see a difference and someone gives you a reasonable, plausible explanation, are you willing to accept it? Because I tend to think that many of those differences will disappear as we gain greater knowledge. But as it relates to some of these differences that exist in the Bible and gaining that knowledge, we have to humble ourselves with the understanding that less than 10% of the ancient Near East has been explored archaeologically, mainly because people still live there. And they would much rather have a living room than an excavation site next door to them. Nevertheless, if you do want to see a video that talks about some of these contradictions, let me know. There are some really cool ones out there, I think, that we can discuss. But for the purposes of our conversations here, as it relates to xenotology and our first foundational assumption, we're going to have to fall back on the evidence that we have. We have testimonials, we have manuscripts, and we have artifacts. Our record is trustworthy for our purposes of conversations regarding our theology of the outsider. So what about the second assumption? Who was Luke? As we read through Luke Acts, the author doesn't specifically identify themselves as Luke. The author does include some we and us sections in there, mainly talking about their travels with Paul, but the author doesn't specifically come out and say, like Paul does in 1st and 2nd Timothy, I, Paul, write to you, Timothy. Luke by name is only mentioned 3 times in the biblical record. In Colossians, Paul says that Luke was a doctor. In Philemon, Paul said that Luke was a co-worker. And in 2 Timothy, Paul says that Luke was with him. It's church tradition and early church leadership that says Luke was the one who wrote Luke and Acts. Many of them date this writing of Luke's and Acts to somewhere between 60 and 90 CE. Irenaeus in around 185 says that Luke wrote it. Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Jerome, and other early church leaders all point to Luke as its author. In light of this church tradition, the author saying that he was a co-worker of Paul, and Paul saying that Luke was a co-worker of his, the evidence saying that Luke was the author of these two books is pretty good. So, back to our foundation here, we have a reliable record written by Luke to a friend of God. So now what? I want us to look at these stories that Luke felt were important enough for a friend of God to know, and why. Like imagine hearing Luke say, I, Luke, have told you, friend of God, this story because blah. Spoiler alert. It's because the outsider is the friend of God. You are Theophilus. And in our next video, we'll continue this conversation. Until then, like, subscribe, comment. Please stay respectful in the comments. There's enough hate in the world right now. Let's create a community where unconventional thinkers feel safe enough to have unconventional conversations. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram. Again, my name is Damian, and I am your Renegade Cleric. Until then, peace.